The wedding was held on a Sunday. Early May. One of those days when the sky looks painted and everything feels like it's happening in a memory. Guests arrived in their best attire, pressed suits, pastel dresses, laughter echoing through the small churchyard. The bride wore ivory. Her veil shimmered as she walked down the aisle, her father clutching her arm like it might be the last moment they'd ever share. The groom stood still, but his eyes moved. Watching. Blinking. And then smiling, just faintly, when he saw her. He loved her. No one could question that. Not even the ones who whispered she was too quiet, too private. Vows were exchanged under the watchful eye of the congregation. The groom's father stood to the side, hands folded, his collar starched white against his dark suit. He looked proud. Almost too proud. As if he'd done something no one else knew about. He was a deacon in the church. A man with 3 decades of sermons behind him. Respected. Trusted. The kind of man you'd call if your life fell apart. After the ceremony, champagne flowed. The couple danced. Pictures were taken beneath the flowering dogwoods outside. It was, by every outward measure, a beautiful day. A good family. A blessed union. But some stories don't begin with a scream. Some begin in silence. And in this story, the silence began that very night. 3 months later, the bride became sick. At first, she thought it was exhaustion. She was working late, managing both a new job and her new life. Then came the night sweats. Then nausea. Weight loss. By the time she went to the doctor, she could barely stand. She was tested for everything. Blood drawn. Vitals checked. And then, the result that changed everything. HIV positive. She collapsed in the parking lot. When her husband found out, he drove straight to the clinic. Took the test himself. Waited. 2 days later, he got the call. Negative. The first crack in their perfect world. He asked her the only question that made sense, how? She swore she didn't know. She cried. Screamed. Said she'd never been with anyone else. Said it had to be a mistake. But science doesn't lie. At night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. She would cough beside him, sometimes whimpering in her sleep. He started looking at her differently. Then he started looking at everyone differently. She mentioned something strange once, something almost whispered. That a few months before their wedding, she'd gone through a rough time. Felt off. Thought it was the flu. A short-lived illness she hadn't told anyone about. Back then, it passed quickly. But maybe it hadn't passed at all. He started to ask questions. Quietly. First to her friends. Then to her family. But it was his own father who gave him the shortest answers. Every time the bride's name came up, the deacon changed the subject. Once, when asked directly, he just said, "Let it be, son. The past is the past." That's when the groom began to remember things. The night his father stayed behind to lock up after church, and she stayed too. The strange tension during family dinners. The time he walked in and found them standing too close in the kitchen, no one speaking. He didn't want to believe it. Not his father. Not her. But something was wrong. He asked her one night, directly. She froze. Didn't answer. Then she packed a bag and left. When he went to confront his father the next day, the older man was sitting alone on the porch. A Bible on his lap. Eyes unreadable. The groom asked him what had happened. The deacon closed the Bible. Said nothing. Just looked out at the yard. That silence told him everything. And yet, the worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was what came next. Because the bride wasn't the only one who had tested positive. She wasn't the first. She had never known who gave it to her. But now, he did. And the truth, the real truth, had been living under his own roof all along. The church bells had rung that day for a wedding. But now, they echoed like funeral chimes. And the man who had once preached forgiveness had become the reason his own family would never heal. He looked down at the ring still on his finger. And slipped it off. Quietly. Without a word. It was a small town. The kind where everyone waved. Where coffee shop conversations started with the weather, and ended in speculation. People noticed everything. And when they didn't, someone made sure they did. The church sat at the town center. White steeple, red door. Sunday service was non-negotiable, not just faith, but tradition. The deacon had been there since the beginning. He was part of the building, like the pews or the hymnals. People trusted him. They let their daughters babysit his grandchildren. Let their sons ride with him to church events. He gave sermons sometimes when the pastor was away. Soft-spoken. Scriptural. Always ending with a prayer for peace. He shook every hand. Remembered every name. He and his wife had been married 38 years. She played piano during communion. Their son, the groom, had grown up under his watchful eye. Baseball, church camp, high school honors. No arrests. No late-night calls. The kind of boy people pointed to when they said, "That's how you raise a man." And then he met her. She wasn't from the town. Moved in from the city. Applied for a job at the local school library. Quiet, but sweet. Kind to the kids. Volunteered during food drives. She had a past, sure, who didn't? But she kept to herself. Didn't overshare. Their first real meeting was at the church's fall festival. He was helping his father run the prayer booth. She came to donate clothes. Her smile was brief, but warm. He offered to carry her box. She said no. He carried it anyway. They dated for almost a year before anyone knew. Quiet dinners. Long walks. She'd drop by Sunday service and leave before the potluck. It wasn't that she avoided people, just that she never tried to be seen. The town whispered about how fast things moved after that. The engagement. The wedding. But no one suspected anything more. At least, not then. His father was the first to truly welcome her. Invited her to dinner. Let her help decorate the church bulletin board. They spent time together, even when the groom wasn't around. Everyone just thought it was kindness. A deacon embracing the future daughter-in-law. Only later did those memories become sharp. The night she stayed late to discuss the wedding readings. The week she joined his Wednesday Bible study group, then stopped going suddenly. A neighbor recalled seeing the two of them arguing behind the church one evening. She said it didn't look romantic, it looked tense. Like something had gone very wrong. Still, nothing concrete. Nothing you could say aloud. Until the diagnosis. When the bride was found to be HIV positive, people rallied around her at first. Quiet sympathy. Casseroles left on the porch. But the mood shifted when her husband tested negative. They asked questions. Was she unfaithful? Was she hiding something? Did she know before the wedding? Whispers turned into rumors. And the rumors began circling back to the church. The deacon's wife noticed he'd been staying out later. That he slept on the couch more often. She didn't say anything, not then. Not until the day she found a receipt in his coat pocket. A motel just outside town. One she'd never heard of before. She said nothing to him. But she did ask her son a question he didn't know how to answer. Do you trust her? He couldn't answer that. Because he didn't even trust his own instincts anymore. What once felt like love now felt like fiction. And every kind gesture, now had a shadow. He found her journal weeks after she left. Buried in a drawer, hidden beneath a stack of cards from the wedding. Inside were just a few pages. Short entries. But enough to rip his world apart. One entry stood out. He said it would end. He said it had to. But I think he loved the thrill more than he loved me. I wonder if I meant anything at all, or if I was just his weakness. There was no name. No dates. But he recognized the pattern. It was how his father spoke, in absolutes. In guilt. In promises never meant to last. When he brought the journal to his mother, she turned pale. Asked him to leave. He could hear her sobbing through the door. For a week, she didn't speak to anyone. And then one night, she walked into Bible study, placed her wedding ring on the table, and walked out. That was the first time the town truly knew something had gone wrong. The deacon didn't explain. He didn't deny. He just kept showing up. Preaching. Sitting in the same pew. But the trust was gone. Like a house with a cracked foundation, still standing, but unsafe. And no one wanted to be inside when it finally collapsed. She had always been careful. That's what made it so confusing. So impossible to accept. The way she avoided confrontation. The way she kept her distance from anything that felt chaotic. But even the most cautious people make mistakes when they're hurt, or lonely. Or when someone powerful decides to see their vulnerability not as something to respect, but something to exploit. The affair didn't start as an affair. It started with questions. The deacon offered support. His son was busy working. The wedding planning was stressful. She'd grown up without much of a family, and he told her, more than once, that she was like a daughter to him. He'd call her when his son was working late. Asked if she needed help with anything. Told her she was strong. That his son didn't always understand how much pressure she was under. At first, she thought it was just kindness. Then came the late-night messages. Scripture verses. Little jokes. Comments about how she looked during Sunday service. Compliments that came too often, and stayed too long. Still, she didn't say anything. Because when you're engaged to someone, you don't accuse their father of crossing a line. You don't destroy a family based on a feeling. But feelings can turn into evidence. And silence can turn into permission. The first time it happened, she blamed herself. He'd offered to drive her home after a planning meeting at the church. Said it was safer. But when they pulled into her driveway, he didn't leave. Just sat there. Talked about how hard marriage could be. How he regretted some of the choices he'd made in his own. Then he reached over and touched her cheek. She froze. Didn't pull away. But didn't lean in either. He left after that. No apology. Just a deep sigh, and a warning not to tell anyone. She didn't. She tried to forget. Tried to move forward. The wedding was weeks away, and she convinced herself it was a one-time thing. A moment of confusion. Nothing more. But it wasn't the last time. After that, he started visiting her at work. Waiting in the parking lot. Asking her to meet him, just to talk. Said he was trying to sort through his own feelings. That he didn't want to hurt anyone. But his presence, his insistence, began to suffocate her. He never threatened her. Never forced her. But emotional pressure can be just as heavy as violence. He knew exactly how to phrase things so she felt trapped. I've been carrying this alone, he'd say. You're the only person who really sees me. There were times she would cry after seeing him. Times she told herself she had to tell the truth. But every time she tried, something stopped her. Fear. Shame. The knowledge that no one would believe her over him. Because who would question a church deacon with 30 years of trust behind him? So it continued. In stolen moments. In silence. Until the day she got sick. When the doctor told her, she didn't think of her past. She thought of him. Of every night he said he didn't need protection, because he'd been tested. Of every time he swore it was safe, because he was careful. He had lied. And in that moment, she knew the truth would come for them both. But still, she kept quiet. She didn't tell her husband. Didn't confess the affair. Only said she didn't know how she'd gotten it. That maybe it was from before him. From someone she barely remembered. A mistake she hadn't realized had consequences. Because as much as she hated what had happened, she still loved the man she'd married. And telling him the truth meant destroying him. But secrets don't disappear. They leak. They rot. And the more she tried to hold it in, the more her world unraveled. She started seeing someone. A therapist. Wrote everything down in a journal. Tried to purge the guilt, the fear, the shame, but the truth doesn't go away just because you whisper it instead of shouting it. Her husband noticed the change. She barely touched him. Barely spoke. Some nights she cried in the bathroom with the door locked. Other nights, she just sat in the dark, staring at nothing. He asked what was wrong. She said, "I can't fix it." He asked, "Fix what?" She said, "Everything." The journal was supposed to be private. She never meant for him to find it. But once he did, there was no way to unsee the words. He read every page. 3 times. At first, he thought it was someone else. But then he remembered the things he'd ignored. The glances. The awkward silences. The subtle shifts in her behavior when his father entered a room. And he realized, the person he trusted the most had done the unthinkable. It wasn't just betrayal. It was violation. On every level. Of marriage. Of family. Of faith. And worst of all, of safety. Because his father didn't just cheat. He infected. With a virus. With guilt. With silence. And now, everything that had once felt sacred, felt contaminated. The ring on his finger. The Bible on the table. The house they'd built. All of it. Tainted. By a secret that had waited, patiently, to be exposed. It happened on a Tuesday. The groom came home from work to find the front door open. Not wide, just enough to notice. Her shoes were gone. Her coat, missing. No note. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of a faucet still dripping in the kitchen. At first, he thought she was out. Then he saw the bedroom. Drawers pulled open. Clothes scattered. The wedding photo was face down on the nightstand. She had left. Without warning. Without explanation. But not without reason. He called her phone. Straight to voicemail. Called again. Left a message. "Come home. Please." But she didn't. The next morning, she sent one text. "I'm sorry. I had to go." That was all. No address. No return. He sat at the kitchen table for hours, the phone in his hand, his other hand clenched so tightly around his ring that the metal cut into his skin. And then, he called his father. Not for comfort. For answers. The deacon didn't answer at first. The second call went to voicemail. The third, too. But on the fourth, he picked up. "Don't do this," he said. Not angry. Just tired. The groom didn't shout. Didn't cry. He asked a single question. "Did you sleep with my wife?" There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to confirm everything. And then the line went dead. That night, the groom drove to his parents' house. He didn't knock. Just walked inside. His mother was in the kitchen, stirring soup. She didn't look surprised to see him. Didn't even ask why he was there. She simply said, "He's in the garage." He found his father sitting on an old stool, oil-stained Bible open beside him, hands trembling. "Why?" was all the son could say. The deacon didn't answer. Just looked at the floor. The silence was thicker than any scream. That's when the groom saw it. A small red folder. Medical records. He opened it. Positive. HIV positive. Confirmed 6 months before the wedding. 6 months. And he'd told no one. Not his wife. Not his doctor. Not his son. The son looked at the man who raised him, who taught him right from wrong, and felt the last remnants of respect dissolve. "You could have killed her," he said. The deacon finally spoke. "I didn't know. I didn't think." But there was no excuse strong enough to justify what he had done. The betrayal wasn't just sexual. It was spiritual. Psychological. Biological. The groom left the house and didn't look back. The next day, he filed for divorce. Word spread fast. In a town that small, there was no such thing as privacy. No time for facts to outrun fiction. Some said the bride had seduced the deacon. That it was part of some twisted revenge. Others believed she'd been manipulated. Trapped. No one could agree on the details. But one thing was clear. The church deacon had slept with his son's wife. And she was now HIV positive. And that knowledge, once unearthed, could never be buried again. The bride returned to town 2 weeks later. Quietly. No announcement. No apology. She walked into the pastor's office on a Friday morning and asked to speak to him privately. What she said during that conversation remains between them. But that Sunday, the deacon did not preach. In fact, he didn't show up at all. The next time he was seen, he was standing in front of a hospital. Alone. He'd checked himself into a clinic hours from town. One that specialized in infectious diseases and mental health counseling. It was the closest thing he would ever offer to repentance. The church board met within days. And voted unanimously to remove him from leadership. His name was taken off the bulletin. His seat left vacant. Some said he deserved forgiveness. Others said forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The groom moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. He stopped answering calls. Stopped going to church. Every time he passed the sanctuary, he felt like the walls were looking at him. Judging him. Mocking him. The bride tried to contact him once. A letter. Unopened. He burned it in the sink and flushed the ashes. And yet, in the darkest corners of night, when silence returned and memories crept back in, he still heard the echoes. Of her laughter during their vows. Of his father's voice behind the pulpit. Of a wedding day that was supposed to mark a beginning, but instead marked an ending. And in that silence, the truth sat quietly. Waiting. Because the crime hadn't been just the affair. It had been the deception. The deliberate decision to say nothing. To let two people marry under a lie. To poison something sacred, not just with a virus. But with the knowledge that love had been used as a weapon. And nothing would ever be clean again. The investigation didn't start like most. There was no crime scene. No dead body. No fingerprints on a broken window. Just a tangle of relationships, ruined trust, and a diagnosis that turned whispers into formal complaints. It began when the bride's doctor, required by law, filed a confidential report with the state health department. Routine in cases of HIV. But what followed was anything but routine. A health official made a call to the bride. Standard procedure. Contact tracing. She was asked to list previous partners, any potential exposure. She hesitated, then gave the only name she hadn't shared with her husband. The deacon. That alone wouldn't have triggered a full investigation. But when the groom's mother, who had quietly filed for separation, discovered her husband's insurance records, she took what she found to the pastor. In those files, multiple anonymous clinic visits. Lab tests. One confirmed positive HIV result. Dated months before the wedding. No follow-up. No treatment. The pastor called an emergency meeting with the church board. The deacon didn't attend. Instead, he was contacted by a local detective. Not in the usual way. No arrest. No squad car. Just a phone call. We'd like to ask you a few questions. The deacon came willingly. Brought his Bible. Sat down in the cold interview room without a lawyer. The detective started gently. Can you tell me about your relationship with your daughter-in-law? He didn't flinch. Just stared down at the table. We were close, he said. Too close. Was it romantic? No answer. Was it sexual? Still nothing. But silence can be as damning as any confession. The detective slid a folder across the table. Inside were medical forms, text transcripts, a photocopy of the bride's journal entry. He didn't look. Just closed his eyes. You understand, the detective said, that if you knowingly engaged in unprotected sex while HIV positive, that is a felony in this state. The deacon opened his eyes slowly. I didn't know for certain. Not then. But you were tested. And you didn't tell her. I didn't want to believe it. The detective leaned back. That's not a defense. That's a confession. Later, forensic analysis of the deacon's phone showed months of text messages to the bride. Nothing graphic. Just long, emotionally charged conversations. Deleted and then recovered. He never once mentioned the diagnosis. Toxicology reports from his blood work confirmed that, despite being advised of his status, he had never taken antiretroviral medication. A choice that dramatically increased the risk of transmission. That detail changed everything. Because now it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about intent. The case shifted from family scandal to criminal investigation. The bride agreed to cooperate. Not because she wanted revenge, but because, in her own words, other people deserved to be safe from him. She turned over emails. Voice messages. A diary entry that described an encounter where he said, "No one can know. If they find out, everything I've built will disappear." When asked by the district attorney if she believed he knew he was infected at the time, she nodded. I think he saw me as collateral. As long as his secret stayed buried, the rest didn't matter. The DA filed charges, criminal transmission of an infectious disease, coercion, and reckless endangerment. It made local news within the hour. The article didn't use names. But in a town that small, anonymity was impossible. Neighbors began calling the station. Former church members submitted statements. A woman from the next town over came forward, said she'd been approached by the deacon during a grief counseling meeting. Said he had comforted her, then ghosted her after one encounter. She, too, was HIV positive. That expanded the case. Now, it wasn't one victim. It was a pattern. The police subpoenaed security footage from local motels. Cross-referenced dates and names. One clip, grainy but clear, showed him entering a room with the bride 4 weeks before the wedding. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was undeniable. And with it came a new charge, attempted concealment of a public health risk. When the arrest warrant was served, the deacon was at home. He didn't resist. Just stood on his porch, hands folded in front of him like he was still delivering a sermon. His wife watched from inside, expression blank. She didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just turned away. The trial was scheduled within 2 months. The courthouse overflowed with spectators. The groom sat in the back. Alone. He didn't testify. Didn't speak. Just watched. The bride took the stand. Her voice was calm. Flat. Like she had practiced every word in her head 100 times. He was supposed to protect me, she said. Instead, he used me. The prosecution showed jurors a timeline. Matching the dates of his diagnosis, the dates of the affair, and the date of the wedding. The jurors took notes. Some shook their heads. The defense argued diminished responsibility. Claimed the deacon was struggling with denial, not malice. But the jury didn't buy it. Because at the center of it all, was one choice. He could have told the truth. And he didn't. And someone got sick. Permanently. Irreversibly. The day the prosecution rested, the town's oldest churchgoer, a man who had once donated the pews, stood up and walked out of the courtroom. Didn't come back. Didn't speak to anyone. Just left. Like the truth was too heavy for even faith to carry anymore. The verdict came on a gray Wednesday morning. Rain tapped on the courthouse windows as the jury filed back into the room. 12 people. All locals. All once members of the same community that had placed the deacon on a pedestal. Now, they were about to pull him off it for good. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a closing door. Guilty on all counts. Criminal transmission of an infectious disease. Coercion. Reckless endangerment. Attempted concealment of a public health threat. The deacon didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just lowered his eyes and nodded slowly, like a man who had been waiting for this day, longer than he'd admit. His attorney requested leniency. Cited his age, his decades of service, his deteriorating health. Asked the court to consider house arrest or a reduced sentence. The prosecution objected. They reminded the court that this wasn't just a moral failing, it was a series of deliberate acts. Lies that exposed another person to a lifelong condition. Trust turned into trauma. The judge listened in silence. And then she read the sentence. 20 years. No parole for the first 12. The courtroom didn't cheer. No gasps. No applause. Just silence. A heavy, loaded kind of silence. Because no one really wins in stories like this. The bride sat in the front row. Her face unreadable. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. When asked for a victim impact statement, she declined to speak aloud. Instead, she submitted a letter. The judge read it privately. Later, excerpts were released to the court transcript. I loved a man whose father saw me not as a person, but as something to possess. I was taught that forgiveness is sacred. But so is truth. And what he did to me, can't be washed away by prayer. The groom wasn't present for sentencing. No one knew where he was. After the trial, he'd packed what little he had and left town. No forwarding address. No goodbye. Some said he moved west. Others claimed he changed his name. All anyone knew for certain was that he never returned. His mother filed for divorce within days of the verdict. She never gave an interview. Never told her side. But she stopped attending church. Sold the house. Moved in with her sister 2 counties over. The church, once the heart of the community, changed overnight. Attendance dropped. Donations disappeared. The sanctuary sat half full on Sundays. The pew where the deacon once sat, front left, 3rd row, remained empty. No one dared sit there. The new pastor tried to rebuild, but the shadow never lifted. The community had watched their faith weaponized. Their trust exploited. And they couldn't unsee it. Months later, the bride began volunteering at an HIV awareness center in the city. She gave talks. Quietly, calmly. Not with anger, but with clarity. She never used names. Never pointed fingers. But her story always ended the same way. You can survive a disease. You can survive betrayal. But surviving both takes more than strength. It takes the courage to speak, even when your voice is shaking. Her diagnosis was no longer a sentence. It became a signal. To live honestly. To build something new from the ashes of everything she lost. Still, at night, the memories returned. Not of the affair. Or the court. Or even the illness. But of the wedding. The vows. The music. The moment she looked at the man she thought she knew, and believed, with everything in her, that love would be enough. It wasn't. And that truth stayed with her. Just as it stayed with everyone else who had watched this story unfold. The church ladies who once baked her casseroles now left her alone. The men who praised her husband's strength crossed the street when they saw her. She didn't blame them. They'd built their faith around one man. And now, they were lost without him. The only visitor she kept in touch with was a nurse from the clinic where she first learned her diagnosis. He'd once told her something simple. Something she held on to. Sometimes, healing isn't about feeling better. It's about learning how to live with the scar. And that scar. It ran through more than her. It cut through a family. A marriage. A church. A town. But it also revealed something people never expected. That truth, even ugly truth, was more sacred than the illusion of goodness. Because the man they'd all trusted had turned salvation into a disguise. And beneath it was a silence so loud, it still rang through every stained glass window. Years passed. The town moved on, outwardly. Shops reopened. The church repainted its sign. New families moved in, unaware of the story that had once brought everything to a standstill. But for those who had lived through it, nothing really felt the same. The pews never filled the way they used to. The Wednesday night dinners stopped. The smiles were thinner. Laughter sounded rehearsed. As if people were still pretending that faith alone could patch what had been broken. The deacon remained behind bars. A model inmate, they said. Always polite. Always quiet. He read from his Bible daily. Led prayer circles for men who didn't know his full story. Or didn't ask. Maybe they just saw another old man with weary eyes and a voice that knew Scripture by heart. But Scripture can't save a man from himself. And he knew that. The bride, no longer anyone's bride, stayed in the city. Changed her name. Started a non-profit that offered counseling and legal aid to women who had been manipulated by powerful men in trusted positions. Teachers. Coaches. Clergy. She didn't tell her story anymore. She didn't need to. Because it was no longer about her. It was about the pattern. The way predators cloak themselves in decency. The way silence becomes a tool. The way love can be used like a weapon, if held by the wrong hands. She dated again, eventually. Carefully. Slowly. She disclosed her diagnosis on the third date. Always the third. Not out of fear, but principle. She said it plainly. Without apology. And those who flinched didn't get a fourth. She never married again. But she said she found peace. Not in forgiveness. In boundaries. The groom, the man who had once worn the ring, was never heard from again. Some say he started over out west. Built houses. Stayed away from churches. One person claimed they saw him at a gas station years later, older, quieter, with a tired look that never quite lifted. He didn't speak to them. Just nodded. Paid. Drove off. And the rest is only rumor. There are stories that end with answers. This isn't one of them. This story ends with questions. What do we owe to the people we trust? How much silence is complicity? How do you recover from a betrayal that rewrites your entire identity? There's no manual. No prayer that undoes the past. Only choices. Small ones. Daily ones. To speak. To protect. To tell the truth, even when it destroys the illusion. Especially then. Because pretending something holy can't be rotten is how this story began. A respected man. A hidden disease. A silent bride. A wedding veil, hiding more than her face. And a town that confused goodness with reputation. In the end, it wasn't the virus that destroyed this family. It was the lie. The lie that what's done in secret stays buried. But the truth? The truth always finds a way to surface. Sometimes in blood tests. Sometimes in journals. Sometimes in a broken heart that refuses to stay quiet. So ask yourself. What would you do? If you discovered the person who infected your life the most deeply? Was someone you'd been raised to love? Someone who taught you to believe in right and wrong? Would you confront them? Forgive them? Would you stay? Or would you run? And never look back? Some secrets are like diseases. Left untreated, they spread. And sometimes, what you hide can kill you. Or someone else. Subscribe for more stories that dig into the darkness we'd rather not see. But need to.